Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. My dad will be so grateful. See you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Fire podcast. I'm your host, Adam Cuello. Today we're kicking off something a bit different. Last year around this time, I took a 3-month break from work and decided to chronicle my time off by recording an episode before, during, and after. I invited my friends Li and David Moltz to interview me at these points throughout the journey. In this 4-part series during the month of May, I'll share my experience taking some time off from work, how I made it happen, what I asked my boss, and how all of this was possible thanks to the power of envisioning. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I invite you to share your comments, feedback, and questions with me on LinkedIn. I invite you to connect with me, comment on my posts, or send me a DM with any questions, feedback, or thoughts about the episodes. All right, let's jump in. Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast, a show about crafting a life you love and making work optional, using the tools of mindfulness, envisioning, and financial independence. I'm your host, Adam Cuello, and I'm so glad you're here. Each episode of the Mindful Fire podcast explores these 3 tools through teachings, guided meditations, and inspiring interviews with people actually living them to craft a life they love. At its core, Mindful Fire is about creating more awareness and choice in your life. Mindfulness helps you develop self-awareness to know yourself better and what's most important to you by practicing a kind, curious awareness. Envisioning is all about choosing to think big about your life and putting the power of your predicting brain to work to create the life you dream of. And financial independence brings awareness and choice to your financial life, empowering you to make your vision a reality by getting your money sorted out and ultimately making work optional. And here's the best part. You don't have to wait until you reach financial independence to live out your vision. Mindful Fire is about using these tools to craft that life now on the path to financial independence and beyond. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Let's jump into today's episode. David, welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. I'm so glad to finally have you here.
Adam, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
For the audience, today's a special treat. We have David Moltz as a guest on the podcast / interviewer on the podcast. I've been trying to get David on the podcast for, I'd say, about 18 months now. And I finally tricked him into being on the podcast by inviting him to interview me about something big happening in my life coming up, which we'll be talking about on the show today. So how does it feel to finally be here, David?
I'm excited. No, you've been asking me to come on for a while and I've been dragging my feet about it. And now you said, why don't you just come on and interview me? That seems like a pretty straightforward way to be on the podcast without having to prepare too much. So with that, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. And so before we get into it, just want to set a little context for the audience. So David and I know each other because he and I started at Google on the same day in November 2010. And so both of us were transplants to California, didn't know very many people, and we started on the same team on the same day and became fast friends and have been great friends since then. And it's crazy to think. I was thinking the other day, David, that we've been friends for over 11 years, which is crazy to think.
It is crazy, especially because the past 2 years pretty much disappeared.
That is true. That is true. A lot has happened in both of our lives in the last 2 years, but it did seem like they were like a blink of an eye / a bad dream with a lot of good things in our personal lives. That we were actually groomsmen in each other's weddings. So I really value David's opinion and wanted to bring him on the show for a number of reasons, not the least of which is he got me into financial independence, but also because I value your opinion and getting your thoughts on this upcoming change I'm going through is really important. So welcome again to the podcast.
Thank you, Adam. I'm excited. With that, are you wanting to share your news with the audience that we're here to talk about?
Yes. Okay. So the reason I brought David on the podcast today is because I want him to interview me and help me explore my thinking on a big change coming up in my life starting next week. And that big update or big change is that I'm going to be taking 3 months off of work. And I've been working at Google for 11 years. I have not taken a break longer than 3 weeks, except for when my son was born for some paternity leave, but I haven't taken much break. So I'm going to be taking 3 months off, and I am excited to explore that with you today.
So Adam, I'd love to hear, how long have you been thinking about this? I've been following your podcast since the beginning. I loved the Julia Lee interviews, especially the ones you did like before her time off and then reflections after her time off. So is it something recent, or have you been thinking about this for a long time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. As I mentioned, I've been at Google for 11 years, basically my whole career, except before when I was doing CitySync, a startup that I started in college. But basically, I've been working straight through since I joined Google 11 years ago with just a couple week vacation here and there every year. And really this idea of taking extended time off, taking a sabbatical is what I was hoping for when I first started thinking about this. I started thinking about it in 2019. This time in 2019, I had just had a baby, was just getting into the swing of things. He was maybe 2 months old. And I was thinking, man, I really need a break, and maybe I can take a sabbatical. Right? Maybe I can take some extended time off at the end of this year. Maybe even my wife can take some time off and we can go to Portugal for a couple of weeks, spend some time there. And even thinking about maybe we can use this as a taste, like a mini retirement, a taste of what it might be like after reaching financial independence. It didn't happen that way. Now it's 2022. I'm finally doing this. Obviously, it didn't happen in 2019. Something interesting did happen in 2019 where I was a great example of using the power of envisioning. I wanted to take a break. I wanted to go to Portugal. I ended up getting a 3-month rotation in Portugal with Google, where I was able to bring my whole family, and we were able to live in Lisbon, and I was working there. That was, while it was an amazing experience and it was a lot of fun and a great adventure for our family, was not really a break because I was doing a very intense job that was new to me. So it was not a break. And so it's been a long time coming. And now finally I got up the courage to ask for what I needed, which was pretty hard to do. And we can talk more about that. But I'm thrilled to be able to say that it's happening, and it's happening a lot quicker than I thought it was going to happen.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. It's actually a funny story. When Adam was in Portugal, I was actually in London doing a work rotation at the same time. So that's one of the other funny things. Adam and I started at Google on the same day. And here we are 10 years later, and he gets to go to Portugal. I got to go to London. But I totally agree with what you said, Adam. While it was fun to be in London, I did have a full-time job, and it was a new job for me. So it was really busy ramping up and whatnot. So it definitely was not time off. It was working in a different location, and I still had the weekends free, but I can relate to being over there, but having to work every day is not time off.
Yeah. And adding on, being in that new environment where you have the ability to travel every weekend, which you did and I did. And we spent 2 weekends during that time together with our wives and my son. But that adds to the lack of rest, right? That's the opposite of rest. Usually you work and you rest on the weekends. Now we were working and traveling on the weekends pretty much every weekend. Carter, my son, was able to go to 8 countries by his first birthday, which is like crazy, especially given what happened in 2020, where we haven't gone anywhere since. And so incredible opportunity. I'm so grateful for it. And it was so fun, but it was not the rest that I was really hoping for when I first thought of this back in January 2019.
For sure. And I imagine some listeners are wondering, what do you mean taking 3 months off? Are you leaving the company? Is this sick leave? Is this vacation? What does it even mean to take 3 months off?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have my journal here, and this, David, I'm a big fan of envisioning, and sometimes when I'm getting a little hippy dippy, I call it the universe. And it's interesting. The universe brought me this journal. I was walking around San Francisco one day, just going for a walk, and happened to walk up the street to the rich area of Pack Heights. And I was walking by this house, and this journal was sitting against a tree in front of this house, like in a little like pile of free/trash. And it was completely wrapped in plastic. And I brought it home and I'm like, oh my God, perfect. It's my journal now. And it's the nicest journal I have. And it also, so I've been essentially doing my annual planning in this journal every year since then. And so this idea of taking time off has been a big part of the last several years of my reflection. And I'm finally making it happen. And as I look back on what I wrote in here, I have this idea of, I want to take a sabbatical, right? I want to take a sabbatical, and why not? I hope for it to be paid. It would be wonderful. Google does not offer a paid sabbatical, but they do offer very generous leave policies. And one of the things that they started offering during the coronavirus pandemic is carer's leave. A lot of parents, David, you know this well as a parent, a lot of parents during the pandemic just became their own childcare. They didn't have daycares weren't open or preschools, and nannies couldn't come anymore, and just it got disrupted. So Google made this available to people that don't have childcare available. It's called carer's leave. And we got quite a bit of that allocated to us over the 2 years that we've been going through it now. And I hadn't taken any. And so I took days off here and there to recharge a little bit. But the reality is I've been working full time and parenting more or less full time. My son goes to school 3 days a week in the morning, but that's not exactly childcare coverage. And so I was able to take advantage of taking this 3 months off. Honestly, it might be part carer's leave, part vacation, depending on how long it gets extended for. But I'm able to use this time through carer's leave, which allows me to get paid my normal salary. And obviously the primary purpose of that is going to be caring for my son. And good news is I'm already doing that anyways. I was just working on top of that as well. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that only.
That's amazing. Yeah. No, it's a wonderful benefit for sure. But at the same time, HR sometimes offers policies, but getting them approved by your manager can be a different thing. For example, a lot of companies offer like unlimited vacation, but many employees don't truly take unlimited vacation at those companies. Instead, they might actually just take the 3 weeks because they still want to get a good like performance rating, and they still need manager approval on this sort of time off. While the HR benefit exists, you still had to get this approved by your manager. So how did you approach that conversation? And the follow-up to that is, how did you decide on the 3 months versus taking 1 month or even trying to take more than 3 months? How did you arrive at the amount of time that you requested from your manager?
Yeah, no, that's a good question as well. And I think that even before taking even a step back from even asking for the leave, I needed to first come to terms with what I needed, right? Myself. And I think that's where mindfulness comes in. A lot of people burn out because they just keep going. They are on the path to burnout and they don't have the awareness or space in their life to even develop the awareness to slow down and ask the question, what do I need? And so I'd be remiss to not acknowledge the absolute privilege I have to have the space, time, resources, money to actually ask the question, what do I need?
As you started talking about the burnout, it made me think about how with the Great Resignation now, so many people are burnt out and leaving their companies. And then I have to think about, I can empathize with that, but how many of them first went and tried to ask for time off first? And definitely not, most companies are not like Google where they might allow that, but potentially some might. But it is an interesting point you made that I doubt companies want to actually lose people because of that large cost of having to onboard and find and bring on new people. So it is an interesting point that you're making, which is basically like, I'm taking this time off so that I can not burn out and then come back and continue working at this company, which I've been at for 11 years. But I need this time off right now in order to sustainably stay maybe another 11 years as an example.
It's happening all over the place. People are quitting in droves.
And I think I would say probably a lot of people are not doing that. They're not asking for what they need, and instead just saying, this isn't it. I need to go do something else. And I've felt that. I've definitely felt that. But I think that the more I use the tool of mindfulness to explore and think about, what is this feeling I'm feeling, right? What is this apathy, this dissatisfaction, this feeling of burnout? That was saying that I had the awareness and the space to see that, oh yeah, I'm headed towards burnout. And I've gone through periods where I was closer and further from burnout. I've mentioned on the podcast a few times, right? Earlier last year that I'm feeling burnout. And I was talking to some people who on the podcast who are psychiatrists, psychologists, and asking like, what is burnout? And really it's like apathy and lack of motivation and physical fatigue and things like that. I was feeling that. And the more I brought awareness to that, I took a 3-week vacation earlier. Maybe that was 2020, actually. It's crazy to think. Like you said, time flew by. But like I was feeling it then. And I took a 3-week vacation, gave me some sort of relief. But I just kept feeling that revving up and revving up. And so I needed to ask myself, what do I need? And then when I did ask the question, now, okay, I need back to the sabbatical, right? Back to the extended time off where I can disconnect. Taking a week off is great. Taking 2 weeks off is great. Taking 3 weeks off, incredible. But you're right back in and after that. And it's just around the 3-week mark when I found that's when I really started to feel the ease and the space that you don't feel after just a week, because what's waiting for you right after that vacation. And so I came to know in myself that I needed more time. And so this gets to your second question, which is how much time? I knew it needed to be more than 3 weeks. And I really wanted to do at least 3 months is what I was feeling. And I think I could have taken up to 6 months of unpaid time. But I, again, needed to get the courage to ask for it. And so taking into account like how afraid I was to ask for what I needed, which I think a lot of people feel, right? One, either out of fear, just like straight up fear, like they're going to say no, they're going to fire me. Mine was a little bit different, right? I had Paul, who is my manager for about 6 years, and he has been an incredible manager. Mine was a little bit more of a feeling of guilt. One, like he's been so good to me. Like I'm now going to ask for this, even though I need it, but asking for it felt like, oh, he's already helped me so much. But, and then also just to the team, like it's never a good time. You're taking time off is going to, even if you go on vacation, is going to put your teammates in a tough spot. And so I felt very weird about that. And it got to the point where it's like later last year, where in Q4, I was like, okay, I need to have this conversation. I need to at least bring it up and start the conversation. And last year, there were multiple times where I was going to do it. And then I just chickened out. And this is a guy that I can talk about anything with. My manager, Paul, and I could talk about anything with him. And so I finally brought it up. And so getting to your first question of how did I make this happen, or how did I broach the subject and have that conversation? It really was, look, there's something that's been on my mind for a long time that I've quite frankly been afraid to bring up. And I've been feeling after working and parenting full time, so I put it in the context of what's been going on. I've been feeling burnt out. What am I feeling? And I feel like I need to take some extended time off. And I wanted to bring that up with you. And we don't have to discuss it now. I would love to have a conversation of what are the options I can explore. And I would love your help in how to explore this. And so I had that conversation with him. And then it turns out that we were getting reorged and I was going to have a new manager, which happens a lot at Google and other places. But because I had this conversation and I had this good relationship with him, I was able to say, look, I know I'm not going to be reporting to you anymore. This is important to me. How can we position this to my new manager and my new team as something that we've already been discussing and that Adam needs, right? We've been talking about it. We've been thinking about when and where and how, and we would like to continue this conversation with Adam on your new team. And that really helped. And then he went and had the conversation or kind of planted the seed with my new manager, Josh, who's also wonderful. And that gave me a lot of peace and confidence to bring it up. I didn't have to start from scratch again, being afraid, although I did chicken out once with the new manager as well. But I knew I could say, I know Paul mentioned to you XYZ. And then when you have time, I'd love to have a conversation about it. And so then we scheduled time and we had a conversation about it, and he was totally fine. He was totally supportive of it. It helped that an email from HR about improvements to our leave policy happened to hit his inbox 2 hours before. That was helpful, but
It's coincidental.
I know the universe, right?
Universe. Yeah.
So we had the conversation, and it was then a question of when and how. That conversation was last Thursday, and today, 8 days later, is my last day. And it just worked out that way. So it happened much quicker. Once I had the conversation, the actual execution of the plan happened very quickly.
You're right. We don't have to get into like why specifically it happened quickly, but I do think that's really interesting that it did happen so quickly, because you almost have less time to plan how you're going to spend your time off, right? Which is interesting. For example, you and I both took paternity leave, but we knew that baby was coming like 9 months in advance or 6 months in advance or whatnot. So we had a lot of time to think about our time off for family leave, to do our planning. In this case, to your point, today's your last day and you're off starting tomorrow. So you have a little bit less time to prepare than normal. How are you thinking about that? Because I know one thing, I feel like you've potentially put a lot of pressure on yourself because you've been very excited about an opportunity like this. I listened to your interviews again with Julia, which were really interesting. And I feel like if you got this approved starting in 3 months, there'd be a lot of interesting additional introspection and planning and things like that. But here we are. You're right. It happened in what felt like less than a week. So I guess, what are your thoughts about having, I think even in Julia's interview, didn't she say she gave her team like 6 months heads up or something like that? Would love to hear, what are your thoughts on it? It's starting tomorrow.
Yeah. It's aggressive. You mentioned the Julia interview, which if you want to hear Julia's story, you can go to mindfulfire.org/Julia, Julia. And the thing about her story is the first conversation we had was 3 months before, at least 3 months before she left Google, maybe even more. And she gave her team a lot of notice, and she also had been thinking about it for a very long time. And so she had a lot of time to think and plan of what exactly she wanted that to look like. And I don't have that time. Although I have been thinking about it for a while, I was so focused on like, I just want the time and not, oh, how am I going to use the time? And so to be honest, I feel a little bit like I don't want to waste this time, like almost a little bit of anxiety around using the time wisely. That's the big feeling I've been feeling recently, is just wanting to use it wisely, but then also not wanting to use it in the same way that I use all my time, which is constantly striving, right? Between the podcast and working at Google and all the various projects that I do and everything. Like, I have so much going on all the time that I don't want this time, which really should be a break, to just be filled with more striving. And that's a tough balance, because I want to use it wisely, but then I don't want to strive to use it wisely. And yeah, it's a little bit weird. And I want to unpack that with you a little bit as today. Hopefully I got some ideas.
Well, no, I wanted to unpack this as well, because I've been listening to your podcast since the beginning, and at least 3 different guests you've had this similar conversation about, which is all about taking time off to rest versus that feeling of needing to be productive. And so that's where I wanted to almost pass this back to you and say, you've probably been giving people advice on, hey, even though you feel you need to be productive all the time, like you should rest. I feel like that's some of the advice that's come up on past episodes. So would love to think about, are you going to take your own medicine and actually rest during this time off versus, I like that you used the term wisely for how you spent this time, because instead of saying like productively or wisely, resting could be a wise thing to do in this case. The other thing that's nice about this is you do have 3 months. So I do agree that if it was, say, 1 month, it would be definitely tricky to rest and be productive if that's what you wanted to do. But with 3 months off, you could rest for a month or 2 and then be productive for the last month or so. But I do know from listening to your previous conversations, you're probably feeling a lot of pressure to work on the podcast, to do things around the house, to really maybe even do some travel with the family. The point of the carriage leave is spending time with your son and your family. I would just love to hear like how you're thinking about this, because you've had these conversations in the past. So as opposed to this being entirely new to you, in your gut, what you should do in this case, I believe.
I hope so. I really hope so, man. Yeah. that's the tricky part about having 1 week to prepare, and also not even really prepare, because I'm also wrapping everything up in 1 week. So like I mentioned, today's been one of the busiest Fridays I've had in a long time because I'm wrapping everything up and I want to leave my team in a good spot. So there's not been a ton of time to reflect on what it is, how I want to use this time. And the big thing that's been coming up for me is this balance of it's productivity and rest, but it's even more to the question of what is productivity and what is rest? What counts as rest? And so I'll first say that absolutely rest needs to be a part of this, a primary part of certainly the beginning. And as I talked about with Julia on the podcast, I don't know how to rest. Like it was something that she was describing, and it like hit me like a ton of bricks that I don't really know how to rest. Every moment of my life, even when I am resting, just trying to relax or whatever, hanging out by myself in the evening, it's working on the podcast. It's editing the podcast or writing stuff for the podcast, or doing, even meditating sometimes can be not thought of as rest because I got to get it done. And so I realized, like Julia was describing for herself, I need to practice rest. And she joked in the podcast that her boyfriend came into the room and he's, what are you doing? And she's like sitting on the couch, like watching Netflix. And she's, I'm practicing resting. And I was like laughing so hard when she said that, because it's like, she like really took it to heart and was like actively practicing. And so that is how I intend to spend the beginning. Now, the question becomes, what qualifies as rest? Does that mean doing nothing? Does that mean setting aside the podcast completely? And if so, which I think it does, if so, do I then front load the work? Do I just disappear? Do I tell people? How do I do this? And I'm figuring that out. And I think that I probably will. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I will spend some time this weekend finishing up the next episode that is going out. And in the beginning of that, recording, probably after we finish here, recording something to the effect of, I'm going to be taking some time to rest. I'm going to be taking some time from work, and I'm going to really practice rest and self-care. And that means I'm going to set aside the podcast for a little bit of time. But every part of me wants to be productive and to use this time to really go for it with the podcast. But I've already been realizing that I need to think how I approach the podcast. And that's a whole nother conversation. But I've already gone from chasing a weekly schedule of publishing to a more like month with one interview and maybe a meditation or two each month, but a much more like fluid type of thing. So anyways, a long answer to a simple question, but yes, I want to rest.
Yeah. And the other thing is not to put too much pressure on yourself now, because you don't have to decide today how you're spending the next 3 months. You can decide throughout. For example, you could say, hey, just for the next 2 weeks, I am going to rest and not worry about anything productive. And then after those 2 weeks, as an example, if you say, hey, I do want to be productive, you still, in this case, have 10 weeks left as an example. So I would say don't feel too much pressure right now to decide exactly how you're going to spend the next 3 months. Obviously, think about it, but start with rest, as you've discussed, and then you can figure out later and still have time to be productive if that's the thing. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and a lot of podcasters will say take a month off, and then what they'll do is they'll go to their archive, right? And they'll play like weekly episodes from their archive, because most new listeners to your podcast are unlikely to be starting at the beginning and listening to every episode. So you probably have some great early episodes to bring back, and that doesn't take a ton of your time. But going back to this concept of rest, which is where I'd want to dig into just a little bit more, because some of the examples used, what are your thoughts? Do you think rest and boredom are correlated at all? So one question I had for you when you're talking about how you're always doing things right now, do you ever feel bored? And if the answer is no, could potentially taking some time off, not doing anything, and feeling bored be a signal that you are resting? Or no, because maybe you mentioned the Julia case of her watching TV. Like when you're watching TV, I don't really think you're feeling bored because you're still actively doing something versus being screenless and maybe feeling bored. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. Haven't thought about that in a really long time, which makes me think in my gut, I feel that I don't feel bored very often. I feel bored on meetings sometimes. I don't notice it as boredom. I don't notice myself saying, oh, I'm bored. Like when I was a kid, I'd be like, oh, I'm bored. This is boring. Well, I feel bored on meetings sometimes, but really, I think that's just a lack of interest in what's being discussed or relevancy. Like I'm on a lot of meetings that I don't say anything. I literally don't say anything. And it is like, why am I even here? But yeah, like in my life, I don't really feel bored. It's more of a feeling of overwhelm than boredom most of the time.
Yeah. And why I ask that is when we're talking about rest could be you spending a day reading a book, having a coffee or tea, just like going very slow throughout the day. Especially another good goal could be like less screen time, because as you really don't have a choice at your current job, but to have screen time all day. And then at night, people are on their phones or working on their podcasts or whatnot, likely on screens
Watching
all
TV.
day. So to rest, one recommendation I would have is definitely try to minimize your screens during this time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I've definitely noticed myself when I'm feeling bored, or it's more like when I'm feeling dissatisfied, right? Or just when I'm feeling, I guess it's bored or dissatisfied, right? Or even just in a bad mood, I just reach for the phone and then hit the slot machine of Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever, just to give myself a little dopamine hit. And I definitely have noticed myself doing that and recognizing it's, oh, you're feeling bad and you're doing this because you're feeling bad. And I want to try to move away from that in this time. And maybe it's taking the apps off my phone and just not using my phone as much, because it does feel like I'm just doing it because I feel bad and I don't feel better afterwards. That's good advice.
What are your thoughts on maintaining a schedule and a routine versus every day just waking up without a plan? Because I think potentially you could still rest with the plan. You say, hey, I'm going to sleep in, but then I'm going to go for a run in the morning. And then I'm going to have a breakfast with my son. And then we're going to go to the park in the afternoon. Like you could have a plan, a routine, but still be resting versus I think when a lot of people think about time off, they really think about the excitement of just, I can sleep in, I can do whatever. I don't have a schedule. What are your thoughts on that? I guess having a schedule and routine versus playing every day by ear.
First, my thoughts are that those people don't have kids. Because when you have kids, you have a schedule, right? There's no way around it. I'm not going to be sleeping in every day. Certainly not while my wife is still working and I'm off, right? As it is, we switch off days. When he's going to school, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, both of us wake up at 7 a.m. to get him to school. And then in those other days, we switch off who gets to sleep in. And it's working. It's working pretty well. It's nice to have that to look forward to. But to your question, I already have a schedule. But how regimented do I want to get with scheduling my free time? Because as I've been thinking about this and how I want to approach it, I've been thinking, okay, what are the pockets of time that are mine? So when Carter's at school, Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 3.5 hours, that's time that I can decide what to do with. When he's napping, basically 2 to 4 every day. And then after he goes to sleep, how do I want to use that time? And so I have those things. And I think what is the bigger question for me right now is back to what we were talking about before is what is rest? What counts as rest? I think watching TV counts as rest, although maybe it's not as restful as taking a nap. But for instance, is reading resting? Or is that productive? Because I like to read nonfiction. Maybe I pick up a fiction book. Welcome to open to recommendations because I never read that. But what about my inner MBA work that I need to do, right? That I'm in this program and I want to do it, but sometimes it is work. It feels like work because it is work. And so like, where does that fit into the rest period? Do I just punt that? And so it's like, what is rest? What is not rest? How much of the quasi not rest is acceptable? And it gets back to something that I've talked about on the podcast before. That is one of my own little quirks and beliefs. It's like, for me, it's always, what's the right way to do it? And I have this feeling that I'm always doing things wrong and I'm not doing it the right way. And so even anytime I have something like this, where I'm talking to you and I'm talking to Julie and I'm asking a lot of people what I should do, rather than just trusting myself and what I want and need, And so maybe I'm putting too much thought and too much structure into it. And maybe I just need to, by having an initial strategy of like just resting and doing what I feel like doing. I don't know.
Yeah, I hear you. Whenever I have to make a big decision, I normally ask a bunch of people as well. And I sometimes feel frustrated after because I get different answers from everyone. And I'm like, oh, this is such a bummer because that didn't really help me because I got 10 different answers, or 5 people are saying this, 5 people are saying that. I'm like, I was hoping it'd be like 9-1, like 9 people said the exact same recommendation. And so I could clearly go forward with that. But as you mentioned before, you're getting different answers from everyone you reach out to. So really, it's just up to you and whatever you personally know in your gut or how you want to spend the time, obviously. So Adam, to go back, actually, one thing I just thought about is earlier you mentioned that your spouse was still working. And I find that really interesting because since you talk about early retirement on this podcast, oftentimes it's potentially one spouse that retires for the other one, either because the other one likes their job and wants to keep working long term, or because one person keeps health insurance or something like that. And when that happens, the early retired spouse can't just travel around the country and do everything when their other spouse still is working. So it does put some restrictions around it. So in your case, with your current time off, if your spouse was not working during this time, then you really could do anything during this time. But if she is still working, now you are more limited to having just the freedom and time, say 9 to 5 while she's working, or you mentioned just when Carter's at school or taking a nap. So really, you do have less time off in this case, where it might just be a few hours a day versus, again, if everyone was off at the same time.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And yeah, definitely have those constraints, and adding COVID to the mix as well. Like, we're not going to be doing much traveling we might do if COVID wasn't happening. Yeah, maybe we go and we live somewhere else and do some slow travel for a time, something like that. But yeah, that's not the situation. And so it's, how do I use this time within this constraint? And whether if this were later on and Carter was in school, we'd have that constraint. Although some people in the FIRE movement just pull their kids out of school and go travel and do things. That seems awesome. There's always constraints. And I really do think about it in terms of the time that I have, really those windows that I described, when Carter's at school, when he's napping, but then also like, how do I want to show up with him? And how do I want to show up with Kathy? I want to rethink those as well, because now I'm not going to have the excuse of, oh, I'm so tired because of work, or I can't do this because of work, which has been the scapegoat at times on and off. And so I have really no excuse, right? So I can really think about, how do I want to show up, and how do I create the habits and conditions so that I can show up in that way? For instance, one thing is like meditating, right? Like, how do I build meditation in as a point of structure? How do I build exercise? How do I do some exercise or activity each day where I'm moving my body and I'm doing things like, maybe it's going for a walk or going for a hike or something like that while Carter's napping. That way, when I come home, I'm in a good mood. Because I've noticed over the last couple of weeks, I've been leading meditations for the podcast community and at Google, but I haven't really had my consistent just meditating by myself practice. And I feel like I've been more irritable than I would otherwise be. And so that's a sign to me that I need to really build that in as a core pillar of this.
For sure. And I know we're nearing the end of our time. So I guess to pivot a little bit, and this might just be reframing one of the same questions I asked you earlier in a different way, but I guess if you were to look ahead at yourself in 12 months from now, like when you're looking back on this time, like, you know, how do you wish you would have spent this time? I know you, like, all the time you hear, hey, if you could go back and give your younger self a piece of advice, like early in their career or whatnot. And I'm teasing that because it's almost trying to get ahead of it. So we're talking about how do you want to spend the next few months? But just to pivot a little bit, if we're a year from now, if you're looking back, does that reframe the question at all with, hey, I'm glad that I spent the time this way or that way? Does it change at all maybe when we're looking more of like long-term, a year out? How did you spend this time versus just right now where we've been talking about, hey, short term, starting tomorrow, what do you want to do?
I think that's a really helpful way to look at it. And I think that's something that anyone who's listening to this can do for any aspect of their life or any decision that they're making. And it gets back to the envisioning piece, right? If I think about down the road, how do I want to be or feel or reflect on looking back on this experience? what do I want to feel or think when I look back on it?
Yeah, because we started earlier on talking about your time in Portugal, and now we're always just looking back on it. Now we're like, how did I spend that time in Portugal or London? Did I travel as much as I wanted to? Did I have as much fun as I wanted to? Did I rest as much as I wanted to? These are all questions, I guess, just again, it's just reframing it a little differently, thinking about the future, looking back. But I think that's important. And honestly, I don't think you can go wrong when you're going to be looking back on this time. Even if you don't do anything except rest for the full 3 months, I think if you come back strong at work and you're feeling refreshed and productive at that time, I don't think you can feel guilty for quote unquote not getting enough out of your time. One of the key parts is getting that rest, which you've been talking about a lot after 11 straight years of work. Likewise, if you are productive and you work on your podcast or your exercise or any other project, that's also valuable time, because otherwise you're trying to juggle it in addition to being a parent, a husband, and having a day job as well. So to take some pressure off you, I think no matter what, you'll have time well spent. But I think it's more just looking back, because I think it's a big part of life is we have regrets here and there. And so I think one, being risk averse, I just want to minimize having a regret about this time. But at the same time, I think that adds extra pressure to maximizing this time off, however that is. And that's where I'm trying to say, try not to put that much pressure on yourself. I think, like I said, even if the bare minimum is you do nothing and you just rest, that is a win based on the conversations I've heard you having with other guests on the podcast.
It's a good point. You mentioned before me asking for other people's advice and input. And that's been the consistent advice from anyone I've asked so far. It's take the pressure off, let go of the expectations. And I think one thing I realized earlier today when I was having this conversation with my inner MBA group, this woman, Jill, said, take the pressure off and be aware of the expectations you have and then let them go. And that was interesting for me because I don't know what the expectations are that I have, but they're there and they're under the surface. And so I need to explore what they are. Not wanting to waste the time is a big one. And as you were talking just now, and you mentioned Portugal, I remember about maybe almost a month into Portugal, I was feeling overwhelmed. And I just had a feeling of dread that I was wasting the time, that I was going to be a failure at my projects, that I wasn't going to make the most of the opportunity living in Portugal and living in Europe. And I remember I was in the Dublin office because I was there. This was just before I saw you. And I remember I was in the Dublin office and I sat down and I said, look, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I need to sit down and write in this journal. And I wrote in the journal and I essentially just kind of like brain dumped and realized, wow, like I'm putting so much pressure on myself to get it right, to do it well. And so getting back to thinking a year from now, how do I want to look back on this time? I want to feel like I didn't put a lot of pressure on myself, that I didn't use it in a driving, being productive, like having to be productive way. I want to look at it. And one thing I wrote down when I was exploring this the other day is, and that's my theme for the year, is I want to relax into the flow of experience, right? I want to slow down. I want to relax. I want to trust myself. That's another thing. I want to look back and said, yes, I used that time and I trusted myself and I got to know myself better. And I created space for myself to do that. I created the space for this 3 months and didn't fill it up with more projects and more things. And I really got to know myself and what's important to me. Because I think that's something that's been on my mind for the last 6 months is, what do I want to do? Like, I'm very grateful for Google. I'm very grateful for the job and team that I have. And it's not my life's work, right? Like, it's not that purposeful. And I'm always trying to be more in alignment with what my purpose is, which is creating opportunity through connection. And so I want to create this space to connect more deeply with myself and get to know myself better and explore the question of what's most important to me. What do I want to do? And so that's what's on my mind there. Another thing that's been top of mind for me as I reflected on last year and moved into the new year, and as I started thinking about taking this time off and what I want to do during this time off, is the realization that everything I say I want and need to be happy, I already have. I spent a lot of time and mental energy thinking, If only this, then I'll be happy. And as I was preparing to have this conversation with you and thinking about how I wanted to use this time, I realized I'd been telling myself that story for so long. If only I could have a sabbatical, then I would be happy. And I have it. And more, every aspect of my life that I look at through the lens of I already have what I want, it's unbelievable. I say I want a sabbatical. I have it. I say I want to be able to teach mindfulness and get paid for it. I do that at Google as part of my 20% project. I say I want to lead mindfulness sessions for teams. I'm doing that. I was talking with our mutual friend, Rashawn, about wanting to be a thought leader. He's like, dude, you already are a thought leader. You have 75 episodes on your podcast on this topic. There's room to grow, but you're already a thought leader. And so over and over again, I've realized if I pay attention, I have everything I say I need and want to be happy. And as I answering your question, a year from now, I want to look back on this time and say, look, I really practiced this idea. I really noticed how everything I want, I already have. And I want to have approached this time from a place of sufficiency and enough rather than a place of scarcity and more of the if only this, then I can be happy, right? Because I have everything I already want. And so can I approach this time from that place of enough? That's really how I'm thinking about it.
Definitely. Adam, I know we're almost out of time. So with that, I'm excited to ask you the Mindful Fire Final Four, which I've heard you ask pretty much every guest on your podcast. So the first question is, for listeners who are interested in taking their own time off work, what advice would you have for them?
For people who want to take their own time off of work, I would say acknowledge what you need, right? Have awareness of what you need and trust yourself, right? If you feel like you need a break, if you feel like you need time off, trust that feeling, right? It's not going to go away. I tried to ignore it for a long period of time. I tried to fill my life with things and projects and interesting things that I like to do. And it only made me realize more and more that I need a break. And so if you want to take time off and you feel like you need that break, ask for it. Acknowledge it for yourself and ask for it from your job or whoever, your manager. And getting back to what you said earlier, Moltz, like the Great Resignation is showing that people are feeling this, right? And if you don't completely hate your job, don't just leave, right? Give them the chance to show you that they want you there. It's way more expensive for them to find a new employee and train a new employee than to let you take a month or two off or 3. And so ask for what you want and acknowledge what you need and ask for what you need.
Excellent. These next two I've heard other guests answer, but now it's your turn. So what piece of advice would you give someone early on their path of mindfulness and meditation?
My advice to people getting started with meditation and mindfulness, I would say start small and realize that you're not doing it wrong. I think there's a lot of talk about meditation is all about clearing your mind and having no thoughts and pushing away thoughts and just having this blissful state. I guess my advice is meditation is not about feeling a certain way. It's just mental training, right? It's like going to the gym for your brain. And so just do it, right? Start small, pick a guided meditation. I have many on the podcast, but even just start with 1 minute, right? 1 minute of focusing on your breath. When your mind wanders, just notice that with kindness and curiosity, and then bring it back and start again. You're going to have thoughts. That's what the brain does. And so start small, realizing that you're not doing it wrong, and then allow your practice to expand from there. It's always said that the best meditation is the one that you'll do. And so pick what will work for you or what you think might be interesting and try it for a little while. And you'll start to see the benefits and want to keep doing it and expand from there.
Perfect. And then a follow-up to that one is very much similar, but what advice would you give to someone early on their path to financial independence?
I would say find a friend like Moltz who will learn everything about it and then come back and teach you. That's how I got into it. But no, for real, I would say get started, right? Get started and set automatic investments up. Look at how much money you have saved up. If you've not started investing, look at how much you have, divide that amount by 12 or 24 months, and then set it to invest a 12th or 24th of that amount of money every month automatically, no matter what, and forget about it. That decision, when I did that when I was probably 6 or 7 years ago, has made an enormous difference in my financial situation and is definitely what I would do. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, read The Simple Path to Wealth. Incredible book, gives you the full picture. And so I highly recommend reading Simple Path to Wealth.
Yeah, plus one to that. And then the final question is, where's the best place to connect with you online? And I like that you ask everyone this. So where's the best place to connect with you?
Yes. Thank you, Moltz. You can find all of our episodes on mindfulfire.org or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Excellent. Adam, that completes my Mindful Fire 4. How do we normally end these things? Do we say farewell?
We do. Thank you, Moltz. Thank you so much for being here, for the time and effort you put into this, and for the guidance that you've given me on my own journey of financial independence over the last 7-8 years. It's been a pleasure, and I'm very grateful for you as a friend. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. And thank you, Adam. Best of luck with the upcoming time off. I'm excited to see where you go. And I'm excited to chat with you in a few months and reflect on the time off together. So good luck. Thanks for having me, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode of the Mindful Fire podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I invite you to hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this. This just lets the platforms know you're getting value from the episodes and you want to be here when I release additional content. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free Envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.